Nietzsche. You know that Nietzsche was the philosopher who announced the death of God.
Jordan Peterson, arguably one of the most influential philosophers of our time, has been frequently found quoting Nietzsche's worries about the death of God in various of his lectures. Not a celebratory event, but a catastrophic one, symbolizing the end of all Judeo-Christian values that have been known and compiled for millennia, from all kinds of civilizations and that are deeply rooted within our psyche. To better understand what Nietzsche meant by the death of God, here's a clip where Jordan Peterson explains it in his first lecture on Maps of Meaning.
And I want to read you something that Nietzsche wrote. It's perhaps the most famous thing he ever said, although it's almost entirely taken out of context and misquoted, and if not misquoted, at least misunderstood, because Nietzsche was one of these strange people who was capable of living 50 or even 100 years into the future, and although he is generally regarded as an enemy of Christianity and superstition, and was certainly an unbelievably outspoken opponent of Christian traditionalism, he also knew that if you let the old gods die, the probability that blood would flood the land was virtually 100%. So let me read you what he wrote. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderer of all murderers, comfort ourselves? What was holiest and most powerful of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we not ourselves become gods simply to seem worthy of it?
Another famous and perhaps the best known passage is mentioned in Nietzsche's book Thus Spoke Zarathustra. When Zarathustra heard these words, he saluted the saint and said, "What should I have to give you? But let me go quickly that I take nothing from you." And thus they parted from one another, the old man and Zarathustra, laughing as two boys laugh. But when Zarathustra was alone, he spoke thus to his heart. Could it be possible? This old saint has not heard in his forest that God is dead. It is clear that Nietzsche had deep worries about the consequences of atheism to replace the gap appearing from eliminating the Judeo-Christian values with another set of solid values. However, he was an atheist and did not ever suggest returning to these values. Nietzsche did not lament the decline of the values and certainly did not suggest returning to them if possible. In one of Peterson's lectures on the giants of existentialism, he explains what Nietzsche thought about these Judeo-Christian values.
Nietzsche, of course, was the great prophet of the death of God and a prognosticator of what the psychological consequences of the demise of this classic meaning structure that was unbelievably ancient, what the collapse of that actually meant. I mean, you can think about Christianity, and then maybe you could think about the Judaism that it was embedded in as even an older system. But that Judaism emerged out of the Middle East, partly out of Egypt, which was enmeshed in even an older belief system, and that was enmeshed in something absolutely prehistoric. And so it was a continuum in some sense of adaptive structures that reigned supreme essentially right until the scientific revolution. And so we're outside of that now. We're in a different paradigm, and there are consequences to that. And that was the sort of thing that Nietzsche was concentrating on. And he actually in some ways made it worse, because Nietzsche was an incredible critic of Christianity. I mean, he wrote a book called The Antichrist, and all he did in that book brilliantly was take dogmatic Christianity to task. Now, one of the things he did say, which is very interesting, was that Christianity died at its own hand. So his notion was that because Christianity, say Judeo-Christianity, had elevated truth to the highest virtue, that search for truth then ended up undermining the axioms of Christianity itself. So it developed a tool, an unbelievably powerful analytic tool, and then used it to, well, it's like we were sitting on a branch and sawed it off with the saw that we had invented. It means that he spent hours, days, weeks, months, concentrating on how to make a single sentence as packed with significance as he could possibly manage. And so Nietzsche said, it's the best arrogant statement I've ever read. He said, I can say in a sentence what it takes other people a whole book to say. And then he said, what they can't say in a whole book. That's pretty good, eh? The end of the moral interpretation of the world, which no longer has any sanction after it has tried to escape into beyond, leads to nihilism. Another critique of Christianity embedded in that sentence, he said, well, Christianity needed to be destroyed even by itself because it put so much emphasis on the afterworld, on heaven, that it forgot completely about life now and here. And because of that, needed to be destroyed because life here is sufficiently rife with suffering, so it needs to be addressed. And people, it's wrong, it's incorrect to inform people that they should wait for some hereafter and justify their suffering in that manner. And so he would say in some sense that even the idea of compassion, which is central to Christianity, is also one of the reasons why Christianity collapsed under its own weight. So you say, well, if you have nothing to believe in, if you have no value structure left, because a value structure says this is better than this, no value structure, no positive emotion. Well, and so what's the problem with that? It's easy to get rid of your positive emotion. That's not a problem because it's rather fragile and tenuous. Try getting rid of your negative emotion. Good luck. That is not going to happen. So what happens is that if your value system collapses, then all you're left with is negative emotion. And that is not a good thing. Well, so Nietzsche would say, well, why do people flee into the arms of totalitarians from the specter of nihilism? It's because totalitarian certainty, even though it involves slavery and the sacrifice of reason and intellect, totalitarian certainty might be preferable to nihilistic chaos. Well, it's a big problem.
Peterson's book Maps of Meaning seems to follow some sort of philosophical influence from the problems raised by Nietzsche, interpreting the problems of a godless world with a major influence from psychoanalyst Carl Jung and literary author Dostoevsky. Jordan Peterson seems to take Dostoevsky's view that we must rely on religion to found our morals and values, whereas Nietzsche stated that the modern man would have to create their own values and morals in a world void of religion and belief, accepting the risk of falling into nihilism, the belief that life is meaningless.
It isn't a matter of creating our own values because we don't have that capacity. It might be a matter of rediscovering those values, which is what Jung was attempting to do. Now, and so I think Nietzsche was actually profoundly wrong in that recommendation. I think he was psychologically wrong. Now, you know, Dostoevsky wrote in many ways in parallel to Nietzsche and was a great influence on Nietzsche. Their lives parallel each other to a degree that's somewhat miraculous. In some sense, it's quite uncanny. Dostoevsky was obviously a literary figure, whereas Nietzsche was a philosopher, a literary philosopher, but still a philosopher. And Dostoevsky wrestled with exactly the same problems that Nietzsche wrestled with. But he did it in a different way. He did it in a literary manner. And he has this great book, The Brothers Karamazov, and in that book, Dostoevsky makes his villains extraordinarily powerful. So if Dostoevsky's trying to work out an argument, he clothes the argument in the flesh of one of his characters, and if it's an argument he doesn't agree with, then he makes that character as strong as he possibly can, as strong and as attractive and intelligent as he possibly can, and then he lets him just have at her. What happens in The Brothers Karamazov, essentially, is that Alyosha continues to act out his commitment to the good, let's say, and in that manner he's triumphant. It doesn't matter that he loses the arguments, because the arguments aren't exactly the point. The arguments in some sense are a side issue, because the issue is, and this is the existential issue, the issue is not what you believe as if it's a set of facts, but how you conduct yourself in the world. And so Dostoevsky, he grasped that, and it's one of the things that makes him such an amazing literary figure, an amazing genius, because he was smart enough to formulate the arguments in a manner that no one else really could, with the possible exception of Nietzsche, and that's quite an exception. And yet he could still, using his dramatic embodiment, he could still lay out solutions to the problems that he was describing that are extremely compelling. And both Crime and Punishment, which is an amazing, thrilling, engrossing book, and the Brothers Karamazov. All of Dostoevsky's great books really circulate around those profound moral issues. And so I've learned a tremendous amount from reading him.
He goes on to further explain that Nietzsche did foresee the importance of these moral issues.
Say if our articulated knowledge is out of sync with our dream, then we become dissociated internally. We think things we don't act out, and we act out things we don't dream, and that produces a kind of sickness of the spirit, and that sickness of the spirit, its cure is something like an integrated system of belief and representation. And then people turn to things like ideologies, which I regard as parasites on an underlying religious substructure, to try to organize their thinking, and then that's a catastrophe. And that's what Nietzsche foresaw. You see, he knew that when we knocked the slats out of the base of Western civilization by destroying this representation, this God ideal, let's say, that we would destabilize and move back and forth violently between nihilism, let's say, and the extremes of ideology. He was particularly concerned about radical left ideology, you know, and believed and predicted this in the late 1800s, which is really an absolute intellectual tour de force of staggering magnitude, predicted that in the 20th century that hundreds of millions of people would die because of the replacement of these underlying dreamlike structures with this rational but deeply incorrect representation of the world. And, you know, we've been oscillating back and forth between left and right in some sense ever since, and, you know, with some good sprinkling of nihilism in there and despair. And in some sense, that's the situation of the modern Western person. And
Nietzsche, however, suggested overcoming as the expression of the most fundamental force of life, the will to power. The process of overcoming has to do with transcending our habitual ways of valuing our traditional dominant values. He calls this process of transcending our existing values as a revaluation of all values. He proposes that a revaluation of values that runs deep enough can eventually lead the entire human race into a new pattern of life, a figure which he calls the Übermensch or the Overman. As he states in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, man is something that shall be overcome. Man is a rope tied between beast and overman, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end. He distinguishes between a master morality and a slave morality. The master morality does not intend to oppress others, but rather create new values and new ways of life, while the slave morality is oriented to resentment towards the will to power, where masters are seen as evil and slaves as good. In essence, a slave morality sees virtue from refraining to exercise one's power and sees evil in doing so. Christian morality rose precisely in these kinds of conditions of enslavement and is still fundamentally a slave morality. It is derived from subservience, obedience, and being a member of a flock. It is a way of hating life and wanting to escape life into a heavenly and eternal afterlife, and whereby evil is forever suffering in hellish torment. It diminishes the real world in favor of the afterlife. Nietzsche proposed finding a new set of values in this life, loving life and not just accepting the good, but also accepting that there is suffering, pain, and annihilation, and that the best afterlife we can experience is none other than another repetition of the life we just experienced. By proclaiming the death of God, Nietzsche looked upon a historical event where God, who played a central vital role in most people's lives for many centuries, has now become one of many facets of some people's lives. There are still believers and churches, but God no longer defines the role of our world. It is for this reason that God is dead. Regardless of this, Jordan Peterson does have a high respect for Nietzsche, and he has influenced his works in many ways. He goes on to convey the incredible depth of Nietzsche and why you should start reading his work.
Take it apart because it's so dense, and Beyond Good and Evil is like that. It's Nietzsche, when Nietzsche was writing Beyond Good and Evil, he wasn't very well. And because of that, he had to spend a lot of time thinking and not very much time writing. And because he was also brilliant beyond comprehension, his ability to distill what he was thinking into incredibly rich phrases is, I think in some sense, it's beyond parallel. And so then you might ask yourself, well, why would you bother reading philosophy, or the philosophy written by someone who's great? And the answer to that is that they can help you think these things through in a manner that you would not be capable of doing on your own, because Nietzsche, I mean, it's difficult to estimate how intelligent Nietzsche was, but I suspect he was perhaps 1 in a billion, which would put him far beyond the 99.999th percentile. And there's a massive difference between the ability of people to think as you move farther and farther out into the extremes of intelligence. And when you have the writings of someone who's 1 in a billion, then you can interact with those writings in a way that enables you, if you'll put the time in, to benefit from the spectacular fact of that intelligence.
In another of his prepared lectures, he explains why Nietzsche had an affirmative philosophy and how Nietzsche's philosophy was useful for him.
I've thought for a long time, from a psychological perspective, I tried to understand whether it was Nietzsche's philosophy that drove him insane, but I think the evidence for that is non-existent. I think he did suffer from a degenerative brain disease of great severity, and I actually think that his fundamental philosophy, which I've read, I haven't read everything he wrote because there's been new books published, but I read his great works in chronological order. I think his fundamental philosophy is affirmative, not negative. But he's a critic, and he wanted to find something that he could stand on, and that's what critics do. If they're real critics, you're not looking to destroy, you're looking for something that you can stand on. And Nietzsche was certainly very useful to me, and I know he was also extraordinarily useful to Carl Jung, who was a real student of Nietzsche, and was really devoting himself to solving the problem that Nietzsche posed, which is, well, what do we do in the aftermath of the death of God? And Jung's answer was, we rescue our father from the depths. And that's the right answer. That's what the university should be doing with young people. It's like your dead father's in the library. You go out there and ferret him out, right? And unite with him and become the thing that keeps chaos at bay, right? Thank you.
So, you might be wondering, what would Peterson have asked Nietzsche if he was alive? Well, he was in fact asked this question back when he did Q&A sessions with his supporters. Here's what he had to say.
Nietzsche thought we would have to create our own values to replace those that would fall because of the death of Christianity. And the psychoanalysts, Freud and Jung, particularly Jung, but Freud began it, I think, and Jung made this explicit, I think, found a fatal flaw in Nietzsche's theorizing, and maybe it's a fatal flaw in relationship to modernism per se, even to the idea of rational thought itself as master of its own house. You can't make your own values. Like, you can aim, you can direct your life, you can cooperate in determining the values that you pursue, but you cooperate with forces in yourself that aren't you and can't be made you. And so what I'd like to ask Nietzsche, because that's the question that I'm supposed to be answering, is, given the mutability of man, the fact that we are composed of multiple subpersonalities, which, by the way, was something that Nietzsche actually mentioned and that I believe that both Freud and Jung relied on when they were formulating their psychoanalytic theories, given the fact that we aren't masters of our own houses, and given the fact that we're divided amongst ourselves, how in the world is it possible for us to develop our own values when we're a mass of internal contradictions, and each of those contradictions is a consequence of something live trying to make its case made? Like, if you were your own creation, whatever that might mean, if you were in full control of your own consciousness and emotions and motivations, well, then you certainly wouldn't be guilty about things you didn't do or did do, because
you could just revamp your value structure at will to optimize, let's say, your emotional state. And, you know, it's good to some degree to be able to do that, to cheer yourself up and to dampen your grief. But man, you're not as in control of yourself as you'd like to think. And you're haunted by many things that you could be and many things that you are. One of the things that really terrified me, I think, enough to change to change the way I was living when I was studying psychology, was that encounter with that psychoanalytic idea that you're not alone in your psyche.